A couple of minutes were the day's most valuable commodity. If only we could make more time, more money, more patience, have better sex, better coffee, boots that didn't leak, umbrellas that didn't involute at the slightest gust of wind. We were determined to make stupid bets. We were determined to be promoted, or else to set the building on fire on our way out. We were determined to be out of our minds.
Tonight I'm thrilled to welcome Kristopher Jansma back to Brookline Booksmith for his new novel, Why We Came to This City. Kristopher's debut novel, The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards, was an honorable mention for the PEN/Hemingway Prize, and he is the winner of the 2014 Sherwood Anderson Foundation Fiction Award.
It's so wonderful to be here. The book just came out yesterday. This is only my second time sort of reading in front of a crowd for it, so I'm so happy I could do it here at Brookline, where I read before from my first novel, The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards. It was only a couple years ago, but it feels like longer. So. There's a short prologue, which is called Why We Came to the City. That's where the title of the book came from, the prologue. So I'm going to read that. It's just a couple of minutes long, and that kind of sets a tone for the book, but doesn't actually start the action yet. And I'll just pause really quickly after that to let you know that we're switching into now chapter 1, and I'll read a little bit from the beginning. You get to meet the characters and find out a little bit about what the story is going to be. So thanks again, everybody, for coming. We came to the city because we wished to live haphazardly, to reach for only the least realistic of our desires, and to see if we could not learn from what our failures had to teach, and not, when we came to live, discover that we had never died. We wanted to dig deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to be overworked and reduced to our last wit. And if our bosses proved mean, why then we'd evoke their whole and genuine meanness afterward, over vodka cranberries and small batch bourbons. And if our drinking companions proved to be sublime, then we would stagger home at dawn over the old city cobblestones into hot showers and clean shirts and press onward until dusk fell again. For the rest of the world, it seemed to us, had somewhat hastily concluded that it was the chief end of man to thank God it was Friday and pray that Netflix would never forsake them. Still, we lived frantically like hummingbirds, though our HR departments told us that our commitments were valuable and our feedback was appreciated. Our raises would be held back another year. Like gnats, we pestered management who did not know how to use the internet, whose only use for us was to set up Facebook accounts so they could spy on their children, or to sync their iPhones to their Outlooks, or to explain what tweets were, and more importantly, why, which we didn't even know. Retire, we wanted to shout. Get out of the way with your big thumbs and your senior moments and your nostalgia for 1976. We hated them. We wanted them to love us. We wanted to be them. We wanted to never, ever become them. Complexity, complexity, complexity. We said, let our affairs be endless and convoluted. Let our bank accounts be overdrawn and our benefits be reduced. Take our Social Security contributions and let it go bankrupt. We'd been bankrupt since we left home. We'd secure our own society. Retirement was an afterlife we didn't believe in and that we expected yesterday. Instead of 3 meals a day, we'd drink coffee for breakfast and scavenge from empty conference rooms for lunch. We had plans for dinner. We'd go out and buy gummy pad thai and throat-scorching chicken vindaloo and bento boxes in chintzy, dark restaurants that were always about to go out of business. Those who were a little flush would cover those who were a little short, and we would promise them coffees in repayment. We still owed someone for a movie ticket last summer, and they hadn't forgotten. Complexity, complexity. In holiday seasons, we gave each other spider plants in badly decoupaged pots and scarves we'd just learned how to knit and cufflinks purchased with employee discounts. We followed the instructions on food and wine websites, but our soufflés sank and our baked bries burned and our basil ice creams froze solid. We called our mothers to get recipes for our old favorites, but they never came out the same. We missed our families. We were sad to be rid of them. Why shouldn't we live with such hurry and waste of life? We were determined to be starved before we were hungry. We were determined to decrypt our neighbors' Wi-Fi passwords and to never turn on the air conditioning. We vowed to fall in love, headboard clutching, desperate texting, hearts and esophagi love. On the subways and at the park and on our fire escapes and in the break rooms, we turned pages, resolved to get to the ends of whatever we were reading. A couple of minutes were the day's most valuable commodity. If only we could make more time, more money, more patience, have better sex, better coffee, boots that didn't leak, umbrellas that didn't involute at the slightest gust of wind. We were determined to make stupid bets. We were determined to be promoted, or else to set the building on fire on our way out. We were determined to be out of our minds. We couldn't stop following the news. Every 10 seconds, we'd refresh our browsers and gawk at the headlines. Dully, we read blogs of friends of friends of friends who had started an organic farm out on the Wachito River. They were out there pickling and canning and brewing things in the goodness of nature. And soon we'd worry it was time for us to leave the city and go to Uruguay or Morocco or Connecticut, to the plains or the mountains or the bay. But we'd bide our time, and after some months or years, our farmer friends would give up the farm and begin studying for the LSATs. We felt lousy about this and wonderful. We missed getting mail. We wondered why we even kept those tiny keys on our crowded rings. Sometimes we would send ourselves things from the office, and sometimes we would handwrite long letters to old loved ones and not send them. We never knew their new address. We never knew anyone's address, just their cross streets and what their doors looked like, which button to buzz and if the buzzers even worked, how many flights to climb and which way to turn off the stairs. Sometimes we missed those who hadn't come to the city with us, or those who had gone to other, different cities. Sometimes we journeyed to see them, and sometimes they ventured to see us. And those were the best of times, for we were all at home and not at once. And those were the worst of times, for we inevitably longed all to move here or there, and yet no one ever came. Somehow everyone only left. Soon we were practically all alone. Soon we began to hate the forever cramping of our lives, sleeping on top of strangers and sipping coffee with people we knew but couldn't remember where from, living out of boxes we had no space to unpack. Soon we named the pigeons roosting in our windowsills. We worried they looked mangier than the week before. We heard bellowing in the apartments below us and bed springs creaking in the ones above. Everywhere we saw people with dogs and wondered how they managed it. Did they work from home? Did they not work? Had they gone to the right schools? Did they have connections? We had no connections. Our parents were our guarantors in name only. They called us from their jobs in distant, colorless suburban office parks and told us we could come home any time, and this terrified us always. But then came those nights, creeping up on us while we worked busily in dark offices, like submariners lost at sea, sailing through the dark stratosphere in our cement towers. We'd call each other to report a good thing happened, a compliment had been paid, a favor had been appreciated, an inch of ground had been gained. We wouldn't trade those nights for anything or anywhere. Those nights, we remembered why we came to the city. Because if we were really living, then we wanted to hear the cracking in our throats and feel the trembling in our extremities. And if our apartments were coffins and our desks headstones and our dreams infections, if we were all slowly dying, then at least we were going about that great and terrible business together. That's the end of the prologue. I wrote that a couple years ago, sort of before I had started even thinking about this novel, and came out sort of all in a rush one day. I guess I was, I don't know, feeling something, but I started, and I didn't yet know at that point sort of what it was going to turn into, but I sort of saw it as this opening to this story. It kind of captures hopefully the kind of the spirit and the world that the characters are living in. So I'd like to read now just a little bit from the first chapter of the book, so you have a chance to kind of hear a little bit about who the characters are and what the story's about. The first chapter is called Living Vicariously. Irene Richmond ran down the narrow foyer, helping guests get out of their coats, which were dusted with flakes of snow that had been coming down heavily all day and still drifted lightly onto the hotel balcony. Coats that cost more than she earned in a month and that were works of art themselves. Hoods lined with fox fur imported from Finland, a quilted sateen coat filled with goose down and patterned in the latest Japanese style of concentric circles. A long vest made of rabbit, Mongolian lamb's wool. Irene got a thrill from just holding them, but it was always short-lived. By the time the guests had finished warning her not to crease the collars or wrinkle the hems, there was someone else making an even more fashionable entrance. During rare pauses, she checked her phone for messages from George and Sara. Nothing, and nothing from Jacob either. Twisting in front of the hallway mirror, she reseated the bobby pins that kept her blonde hair up off her shoulders. She liked the way her neck looked in the golden light by the door, an elegant extension of her one bared shoulder. She hoped it wasn't too much. Abiba had said only to look nice, but Irene had sensed an implication that she not look nicer than the guests. Juliet then added that it was important to look hip, which Irene took to mean young, vital, and strange. Therefore, cerulean leggings, crochet sweater dress, peacock feather necklace, and braided skinny belt. Irene hoped these projected the artistic professional image specified. Every job had its uniform. She checked her eyeshadow, which made her irises look a shade darker, almost black instead of blue. She rubbed at a spot beneath her left eye that had been there for a month now, but had only recently begun to feel sore. Buzz went the door, and she was off to collect a giraffe print bolero from the next artist or heiress to stagger in on midnight black stilettos. The K Gallery's annual holiday party at the Waldorf Astoria was always an impressive affair. All year, Irene and her friends looked forward to this night, the second Friday in December. Not that they didn't go out other nights, not that living in the city wasn't sometimes glamorous, but never anything compared to this. There were 78 people on the exclusive guest list, and the renowned chef Mark Herradura was catering. Honest-to-God movie stars attended. Last year, they'd seen that guy from The Office, and the year before, Cyndi Lauper. This was that other New York, always around them, but never visible. For this one night, it belonged to them too. Even with the first big storm of winter going on outside and flights canceled at JFK and LaGuardia, only Newark soldiered on. They had nearly full attendance. All day, the gallery's owners, Juliet and Abiba, had been commanding Irene from one end of Manhattan to the other. They'd thrust her into snow-capped cars in Chelsea with a wrought iron baboon skeleton, a steal at just $300,000, whose shrieking head had extended dangerously out of the window into traffic. Wearing a pair of Abiba's oversized duck boots, Irene had sloshed across the posh lobby of the Lexington Avenue Hotel, aching under the weight of a moldy yam encased in bile green propylene, starting at just $500,000. 5 years ago, when she'd first begun working at the gallery, Irene had gotten a thrill simply from being near such valuable art, but by this point she was considering telling the driver to take her and the oversized photograph of Trisha Birch's genitals, $1 million, to the George Washington Bridge so she could hurl it out into the Hudson. Or maybe she would just keep going, on and on, out of the city. With the money this one photo was worth, Irene could paint all day and night for another 20 years, or start her own gallery, or institute a progressive artists colony where young dreamers could take up their own work. She could help them avoid the 18-hour days, the perpetual temper tantrums, the name-dropping, the ego trips, the talentless and tormented. Except that, of course, outside of New York City, the Trisha Birch photographs were more likely to get her arrested for indecency than for theft. Maybe in LA, she thought. Maybe in London. Maybe on Mars or Neptune. Juliet and Abiba were not terrible bosses, but they had all the fussiness of artists without the brilliance. They had an eye for slick marketing and could start a trend like nobody's business. But the higher the K Gallery climbed in the Chelsea scene, the more Juliet and Abiba drank sickening amounts of Campari and spoke of selling everything and setting sail for the Marquesas like Gauguin. Rule 1 of living in the city, Irene had learned, as soon as you got there, you had to begin threatening to leave. She was theoretically putting money aside for a trip to France, from which she privately imagined she'd never return, though it seemed like the same $350 or so kept entering and exiting her savings account. Meanwhile, the trip got more expensive, the exchange rate got worse, and the gallery took up more time. Still it was, as they said, a living, and far from a bad one, even when she'd had to examine teacup Yorkie feces to see which should be threaded along diamonds on a necklace for the Bryant Park show, even cataloging 17 years of Percy Bryson's toenail clippings. But she had legit benefits and enough money to pay for a cramped studio apartment on East 4th Street where she could paint at night without disturbing a roommate. Plus, she wasn't starving. If not trips to France, her paychecks did cover the vintage dress or two, and movie tickets, and bar tabs, and green tea smoothies. Buzz. At last it was them, George Murphy and Sara Sherman. George wore a wide smile and a black pinstripe suit. Was it new? It was. Sara had gotten it for him last week at the Macy's pre-Christmas sale to wear to his postdoc interviews. Irene kissed his cheek and inspected his penny coppery hair. It needed cutting. Irene could never resist the urge to ruffle his head lightly, for luck. "We made it," George announced. His cornflower blue eyes met the room over Irene's shoulder and then fixed on her. When he spoke to her or to anyone, they never drifted an inch. His 3 favorite words were, "Did you know?" And after saying them, he had a way of lowering his voice as he told you something terrific about some distant galaxy he was researching out at the North Shore Observatory, as if Andromeda B were a restaurant you might want to check out sometime. He seemed to want nothing more than for others to have him handy to have around. Swiftly, he could explain to you the mechanics of an elevator, the science behind a hailstorm, or the electric spark between your fingers and the fringe of your dress. A good Catholic boy from Columbus, somebody had raised him right. George Murphy was attentive in a city of the attention deficient, and for this he was always looked after. "No one's ever on time to this thing," Irene said. "Here, give me your coat." But George was already hanging it up by himself. Sara slid in for a kiss from Irene. "Some big accident on the LIE," she explained. Irene told her she looked stunning, and Sara said she must be mental. She'd come straight from the gym and was sure she must reek, but of course she did not. Her long purple dress was discreetly sequined. Raven-haired and slender-jawed, Sara forever made Irene itch to break out her charcoals and sketch dark, elegant lines. No matter that she was technically not of the artsy crowd at this party, inside an hour, half the people there would believe Sara was the one throwing it. She'd glide from one conversation to the next, sometimes drawing one or two along with her, until no one was a stranger to her or to anyone anymore. Did you know were also Sara's 3 favorite words, followed not by a fact but by a person. She always knew someone you knew. A girl in your prom limo, your YMCA summer camp counselor, the barista at the coffee shop you frequent, a man you met at that bar in Chiang Mai, the boy whose hand you held on a 3rd grade field trip to the Museum of Natural History. Some people never forgot a face. Sara never forgot a connection. George played with his skinny knit tie in the hall mirror. A 6-car pileup. I've done this commute every day for 5 years, and I've never seen a crash that bad. Irene watched as the mirror's golden, thorny frame transformed George into a portrait, men in crooked necktie. She wished she could tear the clawed lazarette off the farther wall, melt the pigments off the canvas, and use them to paint George right there on the mirror's surface. Why not? But the moment passed. The knot was fixed. He'd stepped away. Sorry, I had to change in a Starbucks bathroom that smelled like dead aardvarks, and... Sara interrupted. Oh, speaking of, this is for you. She dug out an oil-stained brown bag from her bottomless purse. Irene peeled back the paper to reveal a single smushed vanilla cupcake. Little rainbow sprinkles formed a lopsided swirl, winking up like stars. They made us buy something. Can you believe it? In fact, Irene could not believe it. First, Sara was a rotten liar, and second, everyone knew Starbucks was one place you could use the bathroom without paying for something. It might as well be rule 2 of city living. George winked at Irene as she helped slip off Sara's coat. Someone was afraid you didn't eat today, he murmured. Sara pretended to object, but Irene kissed her cheek again. Well, did you? Sara inquired, and before an answer was given, she reached up to poke the faint spot beneath Irene's eye. Irene snapped her head to one side. I had some grapes. She already regretted telling Sara about last week's CT scan, which meant she'd just keep worrying, and eventually she'd ask about yesterday's follow-up appointment. Is Jacob here yet? George asked, absently trying to take Sara's coat so he could hang it. Irene yanked it back. Not yet, but he's always late. But we're late. He's always later. Then as Irene moved to close the door, she saw someone approaching, a young Korean man who was shyly inspecting the wall. It took 2 seconds to see he didn't belong there. Distinctly, she remembered him from somewhere. He wore a sharp gray Armani suit and held in one hand a bottle of Bollinger Blanc. Who brings champagne to a catered party? Irene wondered, as she tried to remember which gallery he worked for. She wasn't entirely surprised to see Sara give the boy a bear hug. William Cho? What are you doing here? Irene, did you know William? He was in art history too with McClellan. You sat in on that one. Irene didn't hesitate to grip his wet, gloved hand in welcome. He was very thin with cheekbones that she was sure she'd have remembered if he'd had them back in college. People don't just go around getting cheekbones, she told herself. Or coal black eyes like that either. She liked the girlish line of his upper lip. He bit it nervously whenever he looked at her. Normally she wasn't very interested in shyness, but something about him was making her blush. Sara turned. George, you remember William? They shook hands politely. Sure, William Cho, right? We met at that newspaper party with Lisa Schmidt. Sara took over as features editor after Lisa went to Madagascar with that guy with the roads. Honey, what was his name? Sara knew it, Henry Fordham Jr., and also that the girl's name had been Lisa Schlick, but from the look on William's face, Irene guessed he didn't know either of them. Hang on, George said. Before we get caught up, let me grab us all something from the bar. It was understood that Irene had to wait until the guests had finished arriving, but Sara said anything involving Saint Germain would be terrific. It was only then that William thrust forward the bottle of champagne that he'd been cradling like a football. George seized it with grateful hands. Damn, this is nice stuff, William. I stole it, William abruptly announced. Like you boosted it? George asked. Don't tell me you boosted this. Sara laughed. Boosted? What are you, a 30s gangster? George winked at her while William clarified. Yeah, I mean, no, I didn't rob a liquor store or anything, but it's been under the coat rack in my boss's office since last Christmas. Turning the bottle over, George peeled a shiny gift tag off the bottom. To Lenny, from the Berg-Geldorf family. Well, thank you, Berg-Geldorfs. I'll see if the guy can put this on ice. He clapped William on the back, and then while Irene and Sara turned their attention to William, he slipped into the main room with every appearance of happiness. Truth be told, however, George was feeling unusually nervous. His mind was elsewhere. Ordinarily, the gallery Christmas party was his best excuse all year to get dressed up and feel metropolitan, but by this time he was in no mood. He looked around, smiling at everyone and no one in particular, as a sensation crept up his spine that somehow they could tell he was from the Midwest. Not these artists could see the sleepy cornfields in his complexion. Not like he'd grown up on a farm. Fairfield Beach was 10 miles from Columbus. His parents had belonged to the yacht club. But tonight he wasn't feeling very yachty. He was counting on a few drinks to settle his nerves. The accident had been over on the eastbound side, but everyone on his side had been rubbernecking like their lives depended on it, like they'd never seen a crash before. Ooh, look at the flashing lights. How exciting. He looked up to realize the bartender was eyeing him. Do you have a bucket of ice we could chill this in? The graying-haired man frowned. This isn't a nightclub. I don't do bottle service. The poor guy looked exhausted. George smiled and took a 20 out of his wallet, the only thing in there, and slipped it into the tip jar. This both worked and didn't. The bartender took the bottle and plunked it into an empty punch bowl, and he angrily began shoveling ice into, resentful at the implication that he could be bought, even if he could be. George fidgeted with the button on his new jacket. Open, the fabric whooshed backwards like a cape when he walked too quickly. Closed, it made him look uptight, almost as bad as that William guy. George couldn't remember having seen him in college, not once. He was polite, quiet, and finely dressed, which meant that Jacob was going to hate him. And just knowing how much Jacob would hate him was making George sweat. Where was Jacob anyway? How was he always later than the rest of them? How did he know? Why wouldn't he just show up so he could be mean to William and the girls could get upset and George could swoop in to set things right and they could all go home? When the bartender had finished sourly shoveling the ice, George ordered something off the ornately printed menu called Death in the Desert. It tasted sickeningly of licorice. He thought about asking for something else, open bar and all, but didn't want to show weakness. He gulped the drink down and pretended to be deep in appreciation of a nearby painting of a man eating his own bowels. If there was one real artist there, it was Irene. Over the years, he'd seen the most outrageous, beautiful things come off her fingertips. She had a sort of effortless, infinite control over the thickness of a line or the shade of oils or the proportion of lightness to shadow. Walking through the city's museums, George was often sure that he'd just seen one of her paintings out of the corner of his eye. Want another? The bartender grumbled. Death in the Desert, George said. That's a pretty hard-boiled name. It's a poem. All the drinks got names of poems. He tapped the company logo on the napkins. Dead Poets Society Functions. Cute, George said. So no living poets. I couldn't get a Billy Collins in a tall glass. The Wasteland is pretty good, the bartender offered. It's got tea-infused bourbon in it. George was soon handed a cloudy, gray drink that tasted like neither tea nor bourbon. In fact, it tasted like nothing at all, which was fine by him so long as it made the party a little blurrier. And then he got Sara a fairy queen involving Saint Germain and blueberries and resumed scanning the room. Finally, he put his finger on it. Last year, more people had been dressed up. A lot more. In fact, he couldn't see anyone else wearing a suit except for William. Had suits suddenly gone out of style? There were an awful lot of piratical mustaches going on around him. 3 different guys with mutton chops. What was the point of looking different in exactly the same way as everybody else? No wonder all their dumb art was so dumb. Edgy, but harmless. Pairs of safety scissors in gilded frames. He turned, and his eyes locked with Sara's. She was chatting with William over by the doors to the balcony, and she gave George just the quickest, tiniest smile, and it shattered him like a pane of glass. Could even one of these people paint that? The feeling you get when you're having a crappy night, and the woman you're about to propose to smiles your way. And with his right hand, George reached across his chest and patted his left jacket pocket. There was the impression of a small jewelry box containing a diamond ring that had belonged to his father's mother's mother, and he would give it to Sara tonight. Everyone says Gossman's going to be the next Rosenquist, came Irene's soft, sweet voice behind him. She was speaking to a very tall woman and gesturing towards a longish painting of various bright-colored website logos. George liked it. At least it was colorful. I loathe Rosenquist, the tall woman said. Irene made a face behind the woman's back as she said, obviously, but that's why. Just then, they both heard familiar belly laughter. It was Jacob, at last, speaking to an elderly woman in a fox stole. Did you skin that yourself? The workmanship's incredible. George, Irene sang lightly as she passed him, that's the curator of the Morrison? He didn't know what that was, but it didn't matter. He was the designated extinguisher of Jacob's fires. Still holding Sara's drink in one hand, George pushed across the room. As he arrived on the scene, Jacob was inspecting the woman's fur. You can hardly see where the hounds got him. Where have you been, Jake? George asked, looking apologetically at the elderly curator, who took her chance to break for the next room. After taking a sniff of Sara's drink, Jacob helped himself to a gulp. Ah, Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie. Long day up at the asylum. Jake clucked his tongue. Had to wrestle a kid to the ground who thought he was a goddamn ninja. Jacob Blauman worked as an orderly at Anchorage House, a private rehabilitation institute up in Westchester. He kept a short, dark, scholarly beard, which, if he ever shaved, would grow back during a commercial break. Of course, Jacob didn't watch television or own one, and the real reason for the beard, George knew, was that a boy Jacob madly desired in their sophomore year had offhandedly commented that it had made him look, quote, less pudgy. Likewise, Jacob had worn the same brown tweed jacket every day since he'd found it at Goodwill, and Irene had said it made his shoulders look broad. These things went right to his head, it was true. But so what? It was his confidence more than anything that George had seen work its magic on all manner of men in bars, train stations, Whole Foods freezer aisles, and library carols. Once Jacob had written poetry, but now he was just a poet. He specialized in a certain type of epic that was a tough sell in an age of text messages. At least my poems don't fit on a square of toilet paper, he was fond of saying. Now he tended a herd of mental patients who, upon occasion, needed to be held down and syringed and straitjacketed. A job he'd found on Craigslist, believe it or not, which put his size and his psych minor to unexpected use. George, he began, slinging an arm around his old friend, I'd like to go to a fox hunt sometime. What do you say? Oh, at least once before I die, George sighed wistfully. Let's set one right up along Madison Avenue. Get some hound dogs, floppy ears, keen sense of smell. You and I follow on horseback, naturally. One of us plays a bugle. You know, I used to bugle with the Columbus Philharmonic. Jacob lifted a cupped hand to his lips. Toodoo, toodoo! Most of the people in the room were looking at them now. George ceaselessly enjoyed his former roommate's irreverence, since he couldn't often bring himself to be rude. With Jacob, it was just the opposite. If he ever had impulses towards politeness, and Sara firmly believed he didn't, they were soon drowned out by whatever he was shouting. George liked to think that they complemented each other in this way, each living through the other when it suited. Bunch of rubberneckers, Jacob scoffed, no quieter. George grinned. Speaking of, I got stuck behind the 6-car pileup today on the... Hang on, where's the bar in this joint? Over there, you'll like it. All the drinks are named after poems. Jacob glowed, like a 1,000-watt bulb. Who couldn't love this town? Irene shot them an unappreciative look from across the room and rubbed nonchalantly at her left eye with the back of her right hand as she schmoozed another donor. Feeling Jacob started staring at her, she stuck her tongue out at him and made bug eyes at the green plastic-encased yam that perched at his end of the bar. George rubbed his stomach and pretended to be hungry. She gestured silently at the moldy yam, and he scratched his chin as if considering it. He pantomimed taking out a checkbook and writing many, many zeros. Shut the F up. Sorry, my son's back there. Jacob bellowed. They have a drink called the Wasteland. Though, it ought to be 2 words, waste, space, land. That's the actual title. Nobody gets that right. Even if it is highly overrated, he went on. It can't touch The Bridge by Hart Crane. Now there's a poem you guys ought to make into a drink, with hints of the East River. He'd have gone on, but got distracted. Hey, why's that Korean kid look so familiar? George ordered 2 more Wastelands, plus 5 flutes of Williams champagne. Now everyone was there. Now things could really get started. Thanks. Yeah, there are things in the book that are either based or loosely based on real life, but not always my life, and not always not always very strictly based. But yeah, I moved to New York City in 2003 to go to Columbia to get my MFA. And at the time, I never really thought I'd stay there very long. I kind of hated it, actually, for the first 2 years that I was there. I was completely overwhelmed. I'd never been in a city that big before. I thought I was really tough coming from Baltimore before that, and then suddenly realized I was in way over my head. So I spent 2 years, more or less, like never leaving, the corridor between my apartment on 102nd Street and campus on 116th Street and Broadway, and just kind of, went back and forth. And But somehow it kind of won me over time, and after a while I started to really love it, and my fiance eventually came and joined me, and now wife, and other friends kind of came and joined us there, and so a lot of it is stuff that I drew from things that sort of experienced being in the city at that age, at that time. Then the novel begins sort of in the winter of 2008 as the sort of financial crisis is sort of landing on New York, and things are starting to change suddenly there for all of these characters. So, yeah.
You talked a lot about poetry in the section that you read, and I was wondering if you could talk about the inspirations for the book.
Sure. There are a lot of poems referenced in the book. There's the wasteland and the bridge, which Jacob talks about in that section. There's a chapter in the book that's sort of loosely based on the wasteland, and another section loosely based on the bridge. And then the whole book is sort of split into two sections. The first half begins with a little epigraph from the Iliad, and the second half from the Odyssey. And they were stories that I sort of looked to as I was writing the book. I wanted to write this story about these five friends sort of joining together, as you kind of got a little hint of there in the first chapter. Irene has something under her eye that's just been checked out, and won't give too much away to say that in the next chapter she discovers that it's cancerous, and so the story becomes about these five friends sort of coming together to try to help her through that experience and try to support each other as it's going on. So the first half of the book is sort of loosely sort of based around the Iliad, the war, the battle, the fight, and then the second half is about sort of coming home afterwards, trying to sort of get back to where they belong again. Those poems sort of fed into it. One thing that I love about both the Iliad and the Odyssey is that you get these sort of epic battles, but then there's always this sort of incidental stuff going on in the background. And, you've got Odysseus keeps trying to find his way home and getting lost and ending up in yet another weird spot where he has to tell some other person the whole story all over again. So that's something that I liked about the book too. I wanted to keep it honest to the regular sort of everyday things going on in the lives of all the characters while this sort of fight is happening in the background. Thank you.
So to that point, you came from writing a lot of short stories. Mm-hmm. Did you get to, this is quite a bit longer than even your last book. Mm-hmm. Did writing short stories sort of inform your ability to have some of those episodes or side plots?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this book, like my last one, actually sort of grew out of some stories. Some of them were actually written in the same year that I started writing. My first novel is called The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards, which is for sale back there too, I'm sure. The bulk of those stories were written in 2009, sort of throughout that year. In that same year, I wrote a short story called The Murphy's Odyssey, which is about a young married couple named George and Sara who are grieving the loss of a friend. And at that point, they were sort of on a boat in the middle of the Greek Isles, because I was taking the Odyssey thing a little too literally. But some of the characters and the ideas that started in that story sort of stuck with me. And then over the course of the next year or two, I wrote a few more sort of short episodes about different characters, and then that sort of rant that turned into the prologue, and then it started to fit together into something bigger. And one of the things that happens, and this is maybe where all this sort of like stuff about epic poetry comes in, is that the stories started getting longer and longer. In the beginning they'd be like 10 pages, and then one time I had what was supposed to be a story turned into like a 60-page thing, and at that point I was like, this either has to be part of a novel or I don't know what I'm going to do with it. So yeah, so that's sort of how it started to take shape. Yeah.
How was the process for this book different than your last one? Whether writing or finding the right voice or...
Yeah. This one took a lot longer. I started writing this one, like I said, sort of roughly around the same time as the first one, the scale is sort of so much bigger, and it was also a more personal story. One of the we talked about sort of writing about the city and trying to draw from that. My younger sister Jennifer passed away from cancer, similar but not the same, but similar kind of cancer to Irene in the story, so it took a lot longer to kind of get through some of that, to try to figure out how to write about that in sort of a way that would be wouldn't be too raw or too sort of difficult, and but hopefully the pace of it pays off. So, yeah. Yeah, I had to do a lot of research about that. I actually reached out to I didn't really know that many people in the art world at the time that I was working on it, I had this sort of idea that she should be surrounded by all this sort of I don't know, kind of postmodern contemporary art, the kind of stuff that I see a lot at museums and never really understand or like, so I was trying to kind of figure out how to get that in there, and I actually reached out to someone that reviewed my first book. I randomly was I loved what she wrote about the book, and she was she worked in the art world and was an artist herself. So I sent her an email and I said, hey, I'm working on this book, and it involves sort of the gallery scene, and I was wondering if you could point me towards like any good places to go, or any things that I should see. And she sent me a whole list, and so I started sort of going around and looking at different things, and so hopefully hopefully the stuff is fairly accurate. We'll see. None of those are real pieces of art that she describes, but they're all sort of loosely inspired by things that I've seen and scratched my head at different museums over the years. Yeah.
Are you still welcome at those places?
Yeah, I just quietly keep my opinions to myself. So it depends on who I go with, whether or not they like them or not. But and which isn't to say I don't love some contemporary art, but for one of the things for me, and Jacob kind of comes to this towards the end of this chapter. There's sort of has another little rant about art at a later point in the story, but he's sort of advocating that art should be something that that doesn't remind you that it's a piece of that it sort of had to be constructed. Every time I see that kind of thing of like the moldy yam in a green case or something like that, it sort of seems like it's just kind of making fun of itself, or making fun of you for coming to pay money to see it, and that pisses me off, I guess. So what I'm looking for usually, and what Jacob in the book sort of is looking for, is something that sort of blows you away and makes you realize that makes you forget that it ever had to be created, I think is what Jacob says. When you see this, sort of his example in the book is the Night Watchman and Rembrandt, and that when you see it, it doesn't you don't sit there thinking like, wow, that's a bunch of paint on canvas, that Rembrandt put together. It just sort of looks like it always existed, and and that's something that I love about certain paintings that kind of feel like they've been born into the world somehow, and books too, hopefully. So kind of my advocation for a certain type of writing, I guess, too. Yeah.
What's harder, raising a child or a book?
Where did he get to? I very difficult in different ways. The hard thing about parenting, I find I'm very lucky that I get to teach. I teach 2 days a week during the year. I teach creative writing now at a college, SUNY New Paltz College, outside New York City, and then I have a day to myself to write, and then 2 days at home with my son. And I think the difficulty of that is sort of just kind of dealing with the growth process is happening, and you just have to kind of try to keep up with it. He's he's sort of getting bigger and more capable every day, no matter what I do. I'm just trying to kind of make sure he doesn't kill himself somehow in the meantime. But with a book, it's a very different thing. You need to be, a lot of times sort of in a total isolation to kind of get, your ideas down, and then at the same time you're like desperate for somebody to read what you've written and tell you if it's any good, and that's always a really delicate, kind of dance. I'm lucky my wife is an editor, and so she's somebody that I've always been able to kind of turn to, and she usually tells me that what I've written is not good, and then I need to go back and fix it, but that's always helpful too. And I have a few friends, other writers in the city that I get together with occasionally and sort of trade work, and I tell my students this in class all the time, but that sort of class workshop thing never really ends. You always need other people to kind of weigh in on what you're working on. So, yeah.
What are you working on now?
That's a good question. I have a new project sort of in the works, but it's still pretty new. But yeah, a new novel. And as I was just saying, sort of my life has become a little more family-centric in the last couple of years since my son was born. My son was born 1 month, almost exactly after the first book was published. So those things kind of came together all at the same time. And so anyway, as my life has sort of started going in that direction, a little further away from swanky parties at nice hotels and more into that. I've been thinking of writing something that's more about family and trying my hand at that. I always love those kind of like epics, or again sort of intergenerational stories, where somebody starts off and is like, let me tell you how I got here, and we'll start with the story of how my great grandfather came over, and then we sort of get the whole saga. So yeah, I'm thinking I'd like to write something like that. So, yeah. Anyway, all right. Well, thanks all for coming so much. It means the world to me. And
he'd already seen the Musée d'Orsay, just as he'd already seen Notre Dame and the Musée Picasso and the Place des Vosges and everywhere else that I suggested we visit. I've seen them all, he said. Then after a pause added, I'm here to see you.